In the early part of Michael Palin's career, his name went round the world due to the success of the Monty Python group, which he began in the 60s with John Cleese, Graham Chapman, Eric Idle, Terry Jones and Terry Gilliam. Working first on TV and then in movies, including The Life of Brian and The Holy Grail.
What? He says they've already got one.
A second career began for Palin when he travelled the globe himself for Around the World in 80 Days and several subsequent travelogues. More recently, he revisited the Python years in 2 volumes of diaries from that period and an animated documentary about the life and death of Graham Chapman. In post-Python mode, he continues to act, travel and write novels, films and diaries. One of the advantages for interviews is that we have 2 volumes of your diaries to draw on. And in your diary entry for Friday, May the 5th, 1978, your 35th birthday, you expressed it in an interesting way. Halfway to 70 today, it begins. This year, you're going to be halfway to 140. So yeah. How does that feel?
Still the same complete uncertainty. And I don't know quite why I write things like that. It's because you feel at a certain time, so many years have passed. And, of course, it's all completely arbitrary. But I halfway to 70 did seem incredibly old. And now I'm, actually a few months off actual 70. I feel considerably younger.
We also have in your diary a sketch of your mother on her 70th birthday. Her face may have aged, her stoop increased a degree, but her energy, mental and physical, is barely diminished. So would that do as a description of you? Not the stoop.
Well, yes. I feel my energy's undiminished, but it clearly isn't because I don't rush around quite as much as I used to. But my energy and enthusiasm for things to do and my curiosity is perhaps even stronger. And I think you get to a certain age where you can look back in a certain amount of comfort that doesn't seem quite the same competitive pressure. So, I've got things to do, but what I do next is not going to make or break my career, for instance. So it gives you a wider option of things you can do and get interested in. But in terms of wanting to do things and wanting to travel and live life, that the energy is undiminished, yeah.
One of the famous shocks of getting older is turning into our parents. Do you recognise your father in yourself now?
I do, yes. It's so odd. It creeps up on you. I don't know why, but I little things like he sort of used to have a kind of a little bit of a whistly hum, my father, as he went around the house. It's terribly irritating. And occasionally my wife says, "You're just like your father." And I realize I'm going to get something out of the fridge. You go, ooh. So, oh dear, I think that. But, yeah, there's probably more of my mother in me, I think, than my dad.
In what way?
Well, my mum was a great sort of feet on the ground. She had a wonderful sort of facility for conciliating and getting on with people and all that, which I'm told I have. But, my father was rather truculent because you had this stammer from, very early on. I don't know when it started. And I think that made a man who had a certain sense of humour and probably quite sociable, made him into somebody who was wary and cantankerous every now and then, so he would be a bit grumpy. And my mother had this wonderful way of sort of mopping up and carrying on with life and all that sort of thing. And I sort of feel that's something I've got from my mum, because I lead this mad life, and yet I managed to keep my feet fairly firmly on the ground.
In your portrait of your mother on her 70th birthday, you refer to her being testimony to the fact that people can thrive on a difficult life. And in a different entry, I told you the risk of having written diaries, in a different entry on your parents' 41st wedding anniversary, you say, "I wonder how many of those were happy those years." Without it being Dickensian, there are hints throughout the diaries that it was quite a tense family.
Yes. It was mainly as a result of my father's sort of rather quick temper, which, as I've said, was, I think, frustration at not being able to say what he wanted to say. And that was ever present, and we couldn't ever discuss it or even begin to understand where it came from. Any other condition, any other ailment, whatever you might like to call it, disability, would perhaps be able to say, well, have you seen the doctor? What does he suggest? What can you take? At that time, it was considered there was nothing you could do for a stammer. I found later on, when I was clearing out my father's things, there was a series of books about relaxing, all published just before the Second War. So, I think he'd been told that just relaxed, it'll get better, which is good advice. But it clearly didn't work, and he wasn't a very relaxed man, except every now and then. So there was that tension around, and when you're at school, you always want your friends to come home, you want sort of all that. And it was always slightly tricky. If I brought friends that didn't know my dad home, they would, what's he going on about? So you'd have to introduce them to the stammer and sort of deal with that. And I think that made for a certain amount of tension. But it wasn't I wouldn't say it was sort of an ongoing problem. But it was, yes, there was an atmosphere around the place.
Were you frightened of your father?
Not particularly. He did, when he got very, very angry, which he would every now and then, he was quite frightening. He would sort of chase you, and he wanted to chase me. There was in the hallway, we had a lot of walking sticks and umbrellas and all that. And after one thing I'd done, it was probably something like a breakage. It was never anything kind of, I was never rude to him or anything like that. It was just, but I would knock something off and a vase would break, and that would set him really going. Clumsy boy, and he'd come out and he raced towards this collection of sticks and umbrellas and got one out and went after me. So I went out, I thought, best thing is go out to the front door, stand in the garden. He's not going to whack me there because all the neighbours will be watching. So I ran off, and of course it was over in a moment. But he did, rage is a very, very frightening thing to see. I've seen it on other people every now and then. But that was quite terrifying when you see somebody out of control.
And your mother's peacemaking skills, which you famously have inherited, if we believe the accounts of the other Pythons, that presumably came from the fact that she would have been aware that he might go off at some time.
Yes, I suppose so. It was just that they had married, and they was in the 20s, and everything was possible. War was over. So they, I presume for a time they were in love and very, very happy. And then he had to move in the Depression of the 1930s from Norfolk, which he loved, up to Yorkshire, which he didn't love quite as much because he was an engineer and he could only get work in places like Hull and Sheffield. And my mother was also from the south, from Oxfordshire. So they were kind of transplanted during the Depression. Then the Second War came, and I think that was after that things must have been very, very difficult. And it was a question of education. How would my sister be educated? How would I be educated? And I think that then it was getting by was the most important thing that my mother could engineer, because you didn't divorce then. I mean, unless something really, really dreadful had happened. That just wasn't an option. And I'm not sure that they ever wanted to, although I can remember saying to my mother once, why don't you get I'd read this in the book somewhere about divorce. Why don't you get a divorce? Don't be silly, dear. Don't be silly. But she managed, and that was the way you did it. And you know, he had plenty of friends. It wasn't a sort of a very unhappy situation. But it was just the two of them were clearly not terribly happy when I was young.
And you did a programme once called Comic Roots, and we're always interested with comedians where it comes from. In that way that, at least in Alan Bennett's presentation of his mother, she is a very, very funny woman who says extraordinary comic things. Were either of your parents consciously or unconsciously funny?
Yes, they were. They were. I mean, my father had a very broad sense of humour. He was very much sort of scatological sort of stuff. And my mother didn't really, sort of embarrassed by his sort of rudeness of his jokes, and she would make rather subtle jokes, which he would not get at all. And then he'd berate her for trying to make a joke which he didn't understand. But I do remember one, it's a really silly occasion, hardly worth asking, but my father had bought a acquired a fake dog mess. I mean, it was all quite an elaborate, very well-made thing. And he thought it was so good that he wanted to create a situation where it would be discovered. And so they were having a little cocktail party, just a few people around after church. And the idea was that he would put this dog turd down somewhere, and my mother would discover it. And he would come in and there'd be all that, a lot of laughter. He would come and pick it up and walk out with it. Shock horror. And I remember it all went wrong because my mother produced this absolutely virtuoso acting skills when she discovered the thing. She was supposed to just say, "Oh, what's that down there?" Instead she went, "Oh my God, what? Oh no! Oh," and everyone I really thought she'd had a heart attack or something dreadful had happened. I'd forgotten about the dog turd. I thought, let's get an ambulance, something awful's happened. And that was just, I sort of realised that maybe there was a frustrated actress there, because her sister acted for a while in the Liverpool Rep. So I think there was quite a little bit of the old, sort of thespian inclinations there.
And you're officially a Yorkshireman, and there's a famous Monty Python sketch about certain Yorkshire stereotypes. I never think of you as a Yorkshireman in the way, though, that Alan Bennett, Geoffrey Boycott, Michael Parkinson are. Do you think of yourself as Yorkshire?
I do, really, and I know it seems a bit odd because I don't talk Yorkshire until I go back to Sheffield, and then, because it's all around you, you end up talking like people used to. But I was born and brought up in Sheffield, and I'm very fond of Sheffield. There were certain things about that city, that particular city, that I still value. The fact it had a really strong character, which was entirely something of the city itself. You know, it didn't think of itself as being cosmopolitan in any way. It wasn't as successful as Manchester or Leeds, but there was a kind of dogged feeling that we produce what the country really needs, iron and steel and knives and forks and all that. And Sheffield people still have that. It's a good sort of, I sort of describe it as a sort of kind of optimistic stroppiness, which is great. And also it's a city which is big enough to feel you've got a big city, but you can see the hills around from the middle. So I'm very fond of Sheffield, and that's Yorkshire, and I'm fond of Yorkshire cricket and Sheffield United football team, because that's, you know, you have to be when you grow up and all that. But no, I'm not sort of the Yorkshireman of the ilk of Boycott or Parky. Although Parky did once, he enjoyed one of the ripping yarns in which there was a man who had called Eric Oldthwaite, had a lot of shovels, and he used to put his shovel next to the other one. That was the most exciting thing he did. And someone contacted me and said, Michael's leaving the BBC. We want to give him a shovel. Would you write something on it? Would you give him the shovel to his leading party? Because he loved the sketch so much. So I gave him this shovel, and I wrote on the shaft, "To the second most boring man in Yorkshire." Love, Eric Oldthwaite. And he loves that. I'm the second most boring man in Yorkshire. There we are.
Although an example of your famous skills as a diplomat and conciliator, there's a footnote in the diaries about this. You can appear to support both Sheffield football teams, which is something that is unforgivable in Sheffield.
Exactly.
But there are bits in your diaries where you cheer separately for Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United.
I know. It's like being Protestant and a Catholic, you know. You just can't do it in Sheffield. But I would explain that by saying that when I came to London, which was 45 years ago or something like that, any little remnants of Sheffield, meeting people from Sheffield, hearing Sheffield even mentioned, was quite important to me, because London has always seemed so incredibly confident and metropolitan and all that. Where's Sheffield and all that? So for either Sheffield team to win a football match, especially if they beat one of the London teams, that was a great moment. So I found myself in the cup final of 1966, where Sheffield Wednesday were playing Everton, supporting Sheffield Wednesday because they were from Sheffield. And I carried on with this sort of illicit sort of love affair for a long, long time, until eventually I went up to Sheffield and someone said, "You've got to tell us, you know, you can't possibly be both." And the earliest team I supported in Sheffield was Sheffield United, the Blades. But I still like to hear good news from both teams while I'm in London. But you cannot say that in Sheffield. You'll be hung, drawn and quartered.
And as you say, you don't sound Yorkshire, but would you at some point, if we'd met you in early childhood, is it something that was educated out of you?
It was a bit. I mean, my parents were Southerners, so obviously I spoke ordinary sort of normal English, whatever one would call it,
RP.
Oxford English.
Yeah.
And we had some neighbours, and they were from Birmingham, and I remember the father, who was a very distinguished doctor, medical man, actually reproving me at one time for dropping an H, because I'd obviously someone at school, talked about Yorkshire, and I remember, it's funny how you remember these things. It must have stuck with me. He was quite angry with me for sounding the remotest bit Yorkshire, which is, that's sad, really. But that was the only moment. I mean, my parents didn't ever say, you mustn't talk like this or that.
And with parents who came from the south and then the kind of school you went to, class, is that something you thought about a lot? Were you aware of class?
Oh, yes, very much. I mean, because my parents, I don't know, it's not silly things like education. And my father had been to Cambridge and he'd been to public school, and he wanted me to go to public school. And so I don't think it was class, really, so much as the fact that this school is the school he wanted to send me to, which was Shrewsbury, is one of the 10 best schools in the country. That's it, no, you don't have to reason why. It was founded in 1552, blah, 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 so there was all tradition and all that element that comes into the class thing. So I wasn't really plugged into the school system in Sheffield particularly. I went to a prep school, private prep school. And, yeah, there was some definite sort of class awareness at that time.
And some people who don't like Monty Python traditionally have said public school humour, but, I mean, as Terry Gilliam and others would point out, it wasn't entirely the case, but it was partly the case with Python, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, any humour comes from a situation you're in, and usually the best humour comes from criticising the situation you're in. I mean, people forget that. They say public school, undergraduate humour, and actually, who are you having a go at? People from public school, people from the establishment, vicars, all the people who one would think of as being sort of, say, members of a class system. So, I mean, it doesn't particularly matter to me where the material comes from, so long as you can be funny with that material. And it was, I mean, my humour, I think, like a lot of the Pythons, probably was honed from sitting in a school classroom. And you forget how much time you spend looking at one person talking to you, hour after hour, week after week. So after a bit, if you've got any sort of, if you're slight sense of mischief or adventure or anything like that, or ability to sort of reproduce gesture or movement or speech, it's all there. I mean, never in my life before or since have I spent so much time looking at somebody from the back as I did from the back of the class. And so a lot of the little, the mannerisms and all that, and one's awareness of how people moved and spoke and twitched and all that was kind of was there at school, really. So it was a great breeding ground. It didn't matter what kind of school you went to, although I think possibly public schools had more kind of dimwits than the state school system. There were some really hopeless masters, I have to say. Anyway, no names, no pack.
And the fact you were allowed to sit at the back, that suggests you were well-behaved.
Well, I always have done, ever since then, made sure I was at the back. People tend to think, you always say, oh, no, you go in the front. I love being at the back, because back of the class is much better. Back of the photo is much better. If you've got a lot of people behind you, I know what they're doing. They're also doing their gestures and sending you up and all that. So it's, my view of the world is I love to observe from behind, that I can watch other people doing their bit. And it was always, unless it was alphabetical order, it was usually the SWATs who went to the front. And actually I was quite good at school to start with, and so I did tend to get into the front row, but then you feel you're missing all the fun at the back, all the really naughty things that are going on, and the engravings on the school desk, and the sort of ink being mixed with lemon sherbet and all that. That's all going on. You're not allowed to do it yourself.
We're going to talk in this interview about some of the various things you've done, but, I mean, clearly Python is something that looms. In those lazy journalistic tags that people use, you are ex-Python or TV globetrotter. Now, if we take the first of those, if we take the ex-Python, do you feel it as a burden that the work that was very largely done 30 years or more ago is still such a huge thing? Do you ever get irritated by that?
Well, I get slightly irritated by ex-Python. I know what they mean, but I'm still a Python. And the only people I can share Python with, really, are the rest of the team. We're the only ones who know quite why we did what we did in the way we did it. So I still, and my outlook on life is still very much that of a python. That's why I enjoy my grandson's company, because they can be very silly, the way the pythons could be, and come up with completely spotty, impromptu ideas in a way that most people, once they get into life and all its responsibilities, don't do. So I think of myself as a python. It is interesting and, of course, wonderful for us that Python has lasted for so long. I mean, we finished it, 1972 we finished the television series, apart from one we made without John, 6 programmes. And the films were all done by 1982, so that's, nearly 30 years. And yet, people still talk about it, still come up to us, still quote sketches, and Spamalot is running, and I went to see Spamalot the other night, and people adore it, on Come the Nights Who Say Ni, and they're wonderfully staged, these great tall creatures and with wonderful outfits on. I remember doing that sketch in 2 hours on a cold day on a Scottish moorland, and the rain was coming down. It was utterly miserable, and I was on a ladder, and I felt very unsteady. And I just thought, this is never going to work. This is just not going to be in the film. And then you see it now, the lights who say, yes, oh, and people say to me, say Ni again. I said, no, please. So that's inexplicable, but very, very gratifying. I think it must have touched a certain chord, Python, that other shows didn't.
And you use the word silly about Python, and it's an interesting word in England, silly. Some people even say, I like the surreal bits in Python, but when it gets silly, I don't. But Python is a defence of silliness, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a great defender of silliness. In fact, I think there's a wonderful quote. W.H. Auden, no less, said that, if a man can't be silly, he's not a complete man. Which I thought was very, very good. I don't thought Auden was being silly, but perhaps they were. I think the problem is that we all pretend not to be silly. We all pretend to be very serious, doing our jobs and all that. But any area of life I know, whether it's a brain surgeon, or a television presenter, or a bricklayer, or whatever, humour is very much an essential part of it. But very often you're not allowed to show it because you have to, that's your job and you're being responsible. So I suppose my sort of feeling about life is that what I do is as a sort of court gesture-ish way, is try and contact that silliness on different levels. And that's why people laugh at Python, I think, because they say, oh, yes, we are all like that. The human beings are fairly absurd, and our dignity is very often sort of something quite hollow and created, so let's see what's underneath it. So I think just being aware of silliness and humour is very good. It's I think amongst other things, it's a great defence against bullying, which I think is probably the nastiest thing I've ever come across in my life. And there's a lot of bullying that goes on. Some of it institutional, some of it just because that's the way people are. But if you can laugh at people, that is the best way to deal with bullies, as I found at school.
You were bullied at school?
Well, I wasn't bullied much because I could make people laugh, and from very early on, I remember I used to do little sort of 5-minute shows during the break, and I would take a subject, like I remember the coronation was one of them. It was 1953, so I was 10 years old. And I would just do, a little improvised bit. So instead of getting bashed up in the playground, I would sort of entertain, and people would laugh. And if you could make people laugh, and particularly if you could catch the mannerisms of the teachers that they saw all around, that was a good, that let you off the sort of onerous tasks of bullying others or conforming to gangs, and you were kind of slightly on the edge of gangs.
And we talked about the thing of being a Python forever or an ex-Python. The obvious parallel in British culture is the Beatles, where a similar thing that you remain a Beatle forever. Indeed, at the time when they had one member who was dead, John Lennon, later they lost George Harrison, the surviving ones would give the same reason. They would say, well, there can't be a reunion because, for the simple reason that one of them is missing. It's always struck me as interesting that there is an overlap between those two groups who were together for a short time, and yet the impact remains forever.
It's one of the curious things in life is that I've always felt myself very, very lucky to be able to do anything that entertains people and be recognised for that. And I always had heroes. I've never felt myself ever being a hero, but I just was watching others. And, of course, the Beatles, you couldn't get more godlike creatures than the Beatles when we were there in the 1960s. because I was, 20 in 1963, and the first Beatles tracks were the sort of ones that my wife bought me records, Please Please Me and all that sort of thing, I Want to Hold Your Hand. So it was the sort of romantic music we listened to. And it was also, the great thing was that here were Liverpudlians not talking American. All our pop stars up to that time had to talk in a kind of American way because America was entertainment. America provided music. America provided films and all that. So here you got these cheeky people from Liverpool, and yet they had 4 hits in the American top 20 at the same time. This was just, it must have been like winning Waterloo or something like that. I thought, this is a great moment for this beleaguered country that's taken such a bashing since the war. They were heroes, and the first moment I ever knew that there was possibly some connection between them and us was when I heard that Paul McCartney so enjoyed Python that when he had recording sessions, he would stop whenever the Python show was going on. Everyone had to watch Monty Python. And, stopping the entire orchestra at a recording session, that costs a bit of money. And I thought, wow, they like Python? And that's been a sort of odd pattern through my life. I mean, Johnny Cash, another enormous hero, a man of such legendary greatness that, I never thought I'd even meet him, but I did meet him in an American chat show, and I was in the sort of green room, and he came in and ignored everybody else, looked at me, and I thought, wow, I can tell him what a great man he is. He said, "John Cash, love your work." I want those to be on my gravestone, actually. Well, not perhaps with John Cash, but love your work.
Confusing,
that was just, and I was completely gobsmacked and unable to say, well, look, Walk the Line was just the greatest song you ever wrote and all that. But so, sorry, go back to the Beatles thing.
And Cameron Diaz now as well is
Cameron Diaz, yes, she's not actually told me personally she loves my work, and I hope there will be time for her to do that.
There's a moment in the diaries when you and the other Pythons take a Monty Python trivia quiz, and you score 60% on it.
Yeah.
And that is one of the curious aspects of having fans that sometimes frightening, that they know much more about the material than you do.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I remember total embarrassment on one of the travel shows, and I was in Bhutan, no less, right up in the mountains, and I was introduced to this man who had written, a very old man who'd written a poem to a yak, a song about a yak, which had been top of the Bhutanese hit parade, and he sang it to me, and I said, well, that's very nice. I didn't understand what it was, very nice. And at the end, he said, you must have songs in England that you sing. And I said, oh, well, and the only one I could think of was the Lumberjack song. So I sang it on this cold mountain, 17,000 feet above sea level, to a man who'd written a love song about a yak. And I'm going, oh, I'm a lumberjack and I'm okay. And I couldn't remember the first verse. It was completely embarrassing. And we kept it in, actually. So.
No, that's what I wondered, because your fans can notoriously recite entire sketches, and do, as we all know, sometimes to our cost. But do you don't actually have them in your head, those sketches?
No, I don't at all. But and they're there somewhere. But I have another life, which is not. But occasionally, the little things that will come up that one will remember. I mean, I can never forget. I had to learn a lot of Python material in German, because we did in 1972 2 shows for some reason for Bavaria Television, and we had to do all our sketches in German. So I can sing. Ich bin ein Holzfäller, fühl mich stark, schlaf des Nachts und hack am Tag. Ich fälle Bäume, ess mein Brot. Ich gehe auf das WC. Am Mittwoch gehe ich shopping, kau Kekse zum Kaffee. You see, there I can remember the verse, because I had to learn that. It took me so long to learn it. It's a very good thing to do when you're with Germans who berate you for not speaking much German. Oh, we all have to learn English, you don't speak any German. I said, no, I don't really. And what do you know of German? I said, well, ich bin ein Holzfäller, fühl mich stark. And then their eyes go and they back off.
There's recently been a sort of Python reunion, although not a proper one. You, Terry Jones, John Cleese, Terry Gilliam were involved in a liar's autobiography, The Untrue Story of Monty Python's Graham Chapman. For people who haven't seen it, it's this quite extraordinary, co-directed by Bill Jones, son of Terry Jones, animated semi-fantasy version of Graham Chapman's life, which he posthumously narrates because he recorded it as a voice book.
Yeah.
Did it It isn't legally or officially a Python film or a Python project, but did it feel like working on a Python project, given the people who are involved?
Not exactly. I mean, what it felt like, eerily, was, Graham resurrected. Because, as you say, there's this wonderful book, one of the best books about Python. It's called A Liar's Autobiography, and it's all apparent lies, but within it are enormous truths and some very funny things about Python. And Graham had, unbeknownst to us, recorded this as an audio book in the 1980s, and someone found this much later on. And it was very good quality. And the sound on the film that they've made is so good that you have Terry Jones and myself playing Graham's mother and father, and Graham reading the part from the book. And it really was eerily as if Graham was there. It was quite a profound shock, actually, doing it and hearing it and seeing it all put together.
Would you like another sandwich, dear?
What?
They're your favourite sandwich spread.
So this is Nice?
What do you mean, Nice? This is Scarborough. You do too much reading.
It'll do you more good if you eat your tea.
Quite right. You can't get through to him when he's got a book in his hand. What is it, anyway?
It's called Claudius the God by Robert Graves, a fine historical reconstruction of the life of Claudius, the Republican Roman Emperor, thought of in his time as a pitiful fool, though the reign Mr. Graves describes is far from folly.
Is it?
I felt he must be there. I mean, I always feel that anyway with Graham, because there's so many moments when I want to say, oh, Graham, you'd love this, or that's very like Graham. And I look round to see him, and he's not there. And this film, watching it, I thought, gosh, he's behind me, and he's there, the spirit of it. So it's very, I mean, in that way, it's very successful. And it is about Python, but it is particularly really about Graham as a character and the problems he had and his drinking and all that, which was, one of the things that was quite had an enormous effect on Python and how we did Python, what we did. There were some sketches we could never finish because Graham had had too many drinks the night before the recording and forgot the lines. But at the same time, he was the central leading figure of our two main movies, King Arthur, which he did when he was drinking, and Life of Brian, which he did, and Brian, which he did when he wasn't drinking. And in both cases, his performances are absolutely wonderful, for a kind of hero figure who is just desperately doesn't want to be in the film, doesn't want to be part of all this. Will you please go away, leave me alone? So there are admirable things which you learn from the film about old Graham.
It's a sense of what Graham would have wanted. It's very much in his spirit.
Yes, Graham was... Well, Graham was actually a lovely man when he was sober. Could do the crossword in sort of 1 minute flat and all that sort of thing. But once he had a bit to drink, he could be okay up to a point, and then he'd become quite belligerent and rude and, sometimes quite unfairly target people. I remember we were in Oban in Scotland. We'd been doing some filming, and we were in a bar somewhere, and there was a group of Scottish farmers all sitting there, and they were all talking about Edward Heath and what a good Prime Minister he was and all that. And Graham got rather irritated by them. I don't know why. We all said, Graham, no, I'm going to tell them. And he went up to them and said, you know that Edward Heath is homosexual? And they all kind of, oh, he's a puff. All right. And they all wonderfully just got on talking about that. And they didn't rise to it at all. So Graham came back, and I could see it was worrying him as the evening wore on. And he said, he went over to them at the end, he said, if you want to know why I know, it's because I have slept with him. And stormed out of the pub. Ridiculous, really. And they just went on, oh, aye, yeah. Drinking. But it was very provocative and liked to sort of tease people.
You've worked for the BBC. We probably have to say at this point that Edward Heath's sexuality remained a mystery throughout his life and beyond it, and that Graham almost certainly hadn't slept with him.
I think we'd say, viewers, any of you worrying, we think that, well, we're actually pretty sure. I mean, I would say sort of 40% sure. No, 100% sure.
That Graham hadn't.
That Graham hadn't slept with him. No, it was a joke.
The documentary also, it includes the Pythons complaining that you talk too much. And interestingly, John Cleese, in a biographical sketch of you for a press release, said that you talk all the time and it drives people mad. Is that true?
No, it's not true. I mean, I would if I could get a word in. You try and get a word in with any of the Pythons, particularly John. I mean, John is such a naughty, accusing me of talking all the time, and he peddles this thing the same way that he peddles whenever he's in America. He says, and people say, "Oh, so you're Michael Palin?" No, he says, "No, it's Palin." And also he does, even on Desert Island Discs, he chose me for some weird reason as his luxury object. And when asked, I think he said something about, well, it would have been a radio, but with Michael, I don't need a radio, I just listen to him all the time. So he perpetuates this thing. And if you've ever spent time with John, you know that there's not a lot of long silences.
Graham Chapman died in 1989. The final volume of your published diaries so far stops in 1988.
Yes.
Was that deliberate, that you didn't, at that time, you were not ready to publish? Because presumably in the diaries there is material dealing with his death.
Oh, yeah. No, it's nothing like that. I mean, I did a deal years ago when the first diaries came out in 2006 to do 3 volumes. And we weren't quite sure what they'd cover, but 10-year sections seemed to be about right. So it was 78, and then I think we decided to stop the second one on the day I left for Around the World in 80 Days, because that was the start, really, of what turned out to be a whole new sort of strand in my career. And Graham's illness was really at its worst in 1989. And, like people are, Graham didn't talk about it much. There was not a great, it didn't come up. He was always quite positive and confident that the latest round of chemo, whatever, was going to be okay. And it really wasn't until the very, very end that we realised that he was, not going to survive. But even then, Graham, as far as I know, thought he was okay, which is very interesting because he's a doctor.
Mm. And it's apparent now, I mean, again, that parallel with the Beatles, I mean, after John Lennon, but it is, there's film in the Graham Chapman documentary, also in John Cleese's recent stage show of the memorial service, and the shock is palpable on the faces of the Python. I mean, it was clearly a huge physical shock when Graham went.
Yes. I mean, I think by that time we'd sort of accepted it. And I mean, I actually thought he looked very, very ill about 3 or 4 months before he died. And I couldn't quite see where recovery would come from. But the real sort of shock of it all was that Graham had sort of given up the drink. He'd given up even smoking his pipe, which is actually, I think, what was in the end caused his cancer. He was a wonderful sort of calm, rather sort of reflective side of Graham came out then. He was very interested, very encouraging to younger writers and all that sort of thing, worked with Douglas Adams and all that. And that was the real shock, that Graham had entered a part of his life where he'd really got it together. After a lot of mess, he'd finally really got it together. And that's when the cancer got him. And that was the tragedy of it, really.
So presumably the next volume of diaries, that will cover all that, the death of Graham and then the decade beyond.
Yes, yeah. It was quite a sort of... Yeah, it was quite a part of it in 1989. I remember going down to the hospital, the night he died and all that, and hearing that he wasn't expected to live. And that was tough. That was very tough.
And because you keep a diary every day, or have done, you still keep it, do you?
Yes, I mean, it's a record of the day, roughly, that's all, yeah.
But it means,
not every day.
Yeah. But it means you end up with millions of words, and so each volume is just a fraction of what you have written.
Yeah, it's about 20% of what's in the diaries actually goes in, a little bit more, 22%, 23% actually goes on the page.
And are there entire things you've forgotten, are there?
Oh, yes, yeah. Usually things that surprised me greatly. I remember coming across his entry when John had finally got together A Fish Called Wanda, which he'd been talking about, and would I be on board and talk about the character who stammers. And he finally sent me the script, and I sat down, and instead of saying, Ring John's doing this most wonderful thing, I thought it was awful. I thought, this is cruel, it's hard, it's brutal. Where's the humour going to come in this? How can I tell him, I wrote in my diary, how can I possibly tell John, after all this time, that I don't want to do this? And, that was totally... if I had to look back on my life and say, what did I do when Fish Called Wanda came out? Wonderfully, very successful film, marvellous, lovely to do, great success, one of those seamless experiences. And only through the diaries can I see that really I had doubts. And that happens quite a lot, actually. Certainly in Around the World in 80 Days, I discovered this diary, which wasn't the sort of normal diary on which I based the book. Saw the pyramids, got on donkey, donkey's name was Michael, all this sort of thing. It was actually my own feelings as I went through the filming, and it's really sort of rather frightening how worried and anxious I was about whether I could pull this thing off. And the filming was difficult, and I wasn't particularly good at doing interviews and all that sort of stuff, and I didn't know what sort of character I was supposed to be. Am I me? Am I Phileas Fogg and all that? It's all there and the underneath. So that other thing where you say, one would think, well, that's the most unequivocally easy thing you've ever done. And clearly it was a tormented time.
Have you ever told John your initial reaction to Fish Called Wanda?
Well, yes. I mean, he's seen it in the diary. But I don't know. I think we've talked about it. Yes, we have. Yeah, because he's quite interested in all that sort of thing. I mean, John wouldn't say he'd be shocked. He'd be quite amused. He'd say, "Well, why? What? When did your opinion change?" And of course, it changed when he cast Kevin Kline to play this awful character, this psychopath, and you knew straight away that Kevin was going to do it with real class.
And people who publish diaries, it's a risk they take that people may object to what they've written. Has anyone objected to anything in the previous 2 volumes?
No, no, there wasn't anything specific. No, I've got a feeling there might have been just a little bit of inaccuracy here or there. People say, I don't remember that. Well, Terry Jones's reaction was, I don't remember any of this. And I thought that was fair enough.
Yeah. But some of the Pythons are quite touchy, but do you show them the diaries in advance?
No, I didn't. I thought through this very carefully, and I thought, no, this is ridiculous. It's inviting a sort of censorship. They'll just have to trust me. And I tried to make it as... I mean, I love all the guys, really, and we do, on the whole, share a lot and get on well. We have our differences, particularly over business and things like that, but basically I get on very well with all of them. So, I mean, my inclination was to show what held us together rather than what took us apart. But at the same time, I couldn't write the diaries without showing that there were differences, because at certain points, why did we stop doing the series? Why did we take so long to do a film after Life of Brian? That's essentially down to doubts amongst the group, rivalries, people wanting to spend more time somewhere else. So, I mean, the fact that John and Eric come out as people who always want to go and write on a beach somewhere, and Terry Jones and I want to stay at home and write in cold old London and then go to the beach. That's actually, it's not trivial, it's quite important. So things like that come in, but they're sort of they're things about the sort of the sort of physical state of Python, really, rather than sort of tearing it all apart.
The only Python who is not in the Graham Chapman documentary is Eric Idle, and some people read something into that because there was some mutterings about Spam-A-Lot, his musical version of King Arthur and the Holy Grail. Is it fair to see him as slightly at a remove from the rest of you now, Eric Idle? I know he is geographically because he's in Los Angeles, but... Yeah,
I mean, we're all rather removed from each other in terms of the work we're doing, and that's absolutely true. We get together for the odd court case here and there, but... well, Eric very much endorsed Hollywood and the Hollywood lifestyle. And he was very happy there, and he did a lot of work there. From 1990s onwards, that's where he wanted to be. And when you're that far away, obviously lines of communication become a bit stretched. And Eric was doing films that we didn't know quite what they're about or anything like that. He wasn't particularly sort of communicative about what he was doing. But, you know, that's up to him. So I suppose Eric was very much the American Python. But when he came up with Spamalot, I mean, I think, like, my earliest reaction was, oh, no, you know, why do we have to do this? We've got a perfectly good film out there. But he sent us the script and the songs, and they were good. I mean, the songs were great and are great. And in the end, it was endorsed by all the Pythons. I mean, some had differences of opinion as to the content and all that sort of thing. But it's the success of Spamalot has been very, very useful to Python, and it's made us all a bit of money. And you know, I'm glad we went with it. But it's sort of Eric's thing, and yet Eric wanted to make sure that it was a Python thing, because that's the way you sort of sell it. So there was some debate as to whether it should be Eric Idle's Spamalot or Monty Python's Spamalot. And we thought it should be Eric Idle's Spamalot, give him the full credit for what he'd done. And Eric said, no, it should be Monty Python's Spamalot. But I am pleased with it.
But presumably Eric makes much more money out of it than the rest of you.
Yes, Eric makes much more money out of it than the rest of us. Fair enough, he put it all together.
But does that cause resentment, though?
Not with me.
But with others, it does, doesn't it?
Maybe. Resentment amongst the Pythons? Never.
I spend quite a lot of my time interviewing the Pythons or ex-Pythons in various media, and Terry Jones I talked to recently, and he says that you were the one who blocked the plans for a reunion. Around the time of the 40th anniversary, he said that John Cleese wanted to get you together and do a big stage tour, and you were the one that in the end said no. Is that true?
That's pretty much true. I didn't buy the idea of a revival of Python all those years on, and it was fairly simple. Graham wasn't there, and if you didn't have Graham there, all the fans who know him and love him would miss him, and you'd have to get someone else with the thankless task of playing Graham, or just work around him, which we couldn't have done. It was such an important part of the show. The other thing was that I just didn't... There was a lot of debate about size of venues. I mean, Eric wanted to play big venues with screens, sort of screens on either side of the stage and all that sort of thing. John and I were very keen to do a kind of 1,000-seater maximum. So it was by no means agreed that we all wanted to do a stage show. People generally liked the idea of doing a stage show, apart from me. But how it was going to be and what it was going to be like had never been argued through, and I don't think it would ever have happened, actually. But I just had, I remember I was doing a Hemingway series at the time, and I just had to decide what to do. And I said at one point, look, this is not getting anywhere, and I really should declare that I don't really want to do it. And there's no point doing something like that reluctantly, or saying, well, I'll do it as a duty, or I'll do it because we need to make money. That is not what Python was about. Python was about having a good time, about really getting playing the humour, enjoying the sketches, and I felt that was not guaranteed. So why do it?
And for well-publicised reasons of his divorce, John Cleese did need to make money, didn't he? Whereas you, for example, don't particularly.
I've only had one wife, you see. John only listened to me early on. He wouldn't have gone shopping. I mean, John's divorce, that all came sort of later.
Right.
But, that's really knocked him for six. I can't really believe that quite so much money could be exchanged from one person to another person after they, can't live together anymore. It just seems crazy. Still.
And the question of a reunion is going to pursue you to the end of your days, so we might as well get it out of the way. Would you say that you could never see any chance of the surviving Pythons working together again?
No, I never say never to anything at all. I learnt my lesson when I said after 80 days, that was it. I was not doing any more travel. Then I did one more called Pole to Pole and said, right, that's it. Now I'm back to acting. And I've since done 6 more series. So I'm a serially sort of irresponsible in this matter and not to be believed. I can see certain circumstances in which we might get together. But I think it would be something small. I can't see the big, highly publicised, reunion with sort of telly and films and all that happening. I just don't feel inclined to do that, and I'm not sure that the other Pythons would either. But playing some of the sketches again in a small environment, I wouldn't mind doing that. I mean, I just adored playing the sketches, particularly with John. It was just marvellous, you know. It was like, I can't play any music and I can't read music and all that, but it was like the nearest I got to playing a musical instrument well was doing, saying no a lot in the cheese shop, but at the right moment. Or the cat's eating it. That I would love to do, that again. So I would never say never.
Inspector? Mm-hmm? I'm terribly sorry, but I was sitting on a park bench over there, took my coat off for a minute, and then I found my wallet had been stolen and £15 taken from me.
Well, did you see anyone take it? Anyone hanging around? Or?
No, there was no one there at all. It's trouble.
Well, there's not very much we can do about that, sir.
Do you want to come back to my place?
Yeah, all right.
But when you say in a small environment, so what, a small theatre or a TV studio?
That's my inclination, would be to just to do it, to a small group. 500, 600 people or something like that. But not make a great big deal of it, not say this is a major turning point in our career, and not do it just for money. I know that sounds a bit sort of po-faced, but I really don't think money shouldn't be the main thing. The first thing should be that we really want to do it in a way that we can do it best. And I say small environment because John and I were always, maybe it was because me and I always lost my voice on stage, but when we did sketches together, it was much easier to do it to a smaller audience. If you just had fans out there, and we played, Hollywood Bowl, 7,000, 8,000 fans, and they would begin laughing before he'd even started the sketch. And John used to get very cross because John was rather good on pauses, very good on pauses. And he would pause and I would say, it's pining for the fjords. And John would pause a bit and someone said, of course it's pining. And John would get incredibly angry with the audience for coming in with the line. So I think I'd like to do it for that reason in a smaller group.
Although the problem is that it's impossible to bring off, isn't it? Because if you announced tomorrow that you were going to do one night The Surviving Pythons at the Arts Theatre in central London, tickets would be exchanging hands for thousands within a couple. It's something you have to accept. Yeah. It can never be small, can it?
Well, maybe the price for admission might not be small, but I wouldn't say. I would like to make sure that one did it in such a way that anyone could come along, which of course that is difficult, because what I don't want is an audience of people paying $10,000 for a ticket. Then that dull audience, you want to get sort of. I would have a sort of ballot or a raffle or something like that for tickets. Much happier with that. But it is a real problem that whenever 2 or 3 Pythons are mentioned as doing something, it is the new Python film. And I mean, you hear this. I came back from filming in Brazil and said, oh, you're getting together to do a film. And I said, what? Oh, yeah, you are. Python's doing other films. I quickly got home. And it turned out it was just Terry Jones has got a film which is, he's hoping to make, in which 2 or 3 of us have agreed to be animated voices. And it hasn't been made yet, but one of the Hollywood people had put an ad in Variety saying, I'm making this film, it's got all the Pythons in it. Because that's the way you sell things. And so then we had to go around saying, no, it isn't a Python film. And poor old Terry has to say, well, actually, no, it's not being made tomorrow at all. So we've tried Wolf an awful lot now. I think when we do a Python, we never say, oh, forget it. Of course it's not.
In common with the other living Pythons, you've had the experience of being portrayed in drama documentaries, one on TV, one on stage. We'll start with the one on TV. Tony Roach's Holy Flying Circus on BBC4, in which you were played by Charles Edwards. So say most people don't have this experience. So what was it like to be portrayed in that way?
It's a little bit weird. But this particular production I enjoyed so much because it wasn't really attempting to be a sort of naturalistic sort of portrayal of the pythons. That would have been quite difficult. It was wonderfully stylised and silly and very, very funny. And I just laughed a lot at it. So I was quite happy to watch myself, although I thought poor old Charles Edwards had got the sort of the thick end of it, having to play Michael Palin. But it was just kind of odd, especially to watch it with my wife, especially the bits where Terry Jones was my wife and where we're in bed together. And Terry was very upset later. He said, I seem much more like Terry Jones when I was in bed with you than when I was playing Terry Jones. So I've now got 2 wives.
So, it's all going okay here so far?
Yes. It's been the odd article, nothing too bad. Mind you, we haven't opened yet. If it wasn't going well, if things got bad, would you be okay?
Even if all the religious leaders in the world denounce you, I'll be there for you.
Thank you.
Until we die, when I'll go to heaven, and you'll be in hell.
That's nice.
Oh, I'm joking. It's a joke.
It's not a very funny joke.
Terry would have found it funny. Terry's got a terrific sense of humour.
Can I have a cuddle?
Oh, of course you can.
Oh, God, gently, love.
Sorry.
The undiscovered country, as Shakespeare said, from whose bourne no traveller returns. Some people, as they get older, they ignore death. Other people think about it every day. Where are you roughly on that?
I do think about it. And I suddenly think, oh, gosh, they're going to open the high-speed line to Sheffield. I'll be 93 or something like that. And then suddenly, my God, you're 93. But then when I was 45, I thought 70 was incredibly old. And so maybe I'll still be there at 93. I don't feel the doors closing very, very fast. But I feel that, obviously, clearly, time is running out unless I'm some sort of freak or discover some drug. But I don't want to kind of live to the age where all people I know have died, I think you've got to sort of grow old with your mates.
And finally, if we played a sort of desert island project, well, the last question in it, which is one single thing you've done in your career that you would want to be remembered by, what would it be?
Ooh, I think probably the answer I always give, and that is the fish slapping dance from Monty Python. That's undoubtedly the most complete work I've ever done. And, I'm very, very proud of the way I fell into that water and the way I lightly slapped John on the cheeks with pilchards, enraging him to the point where he hits me with a pike. I mean, and I show that to people and almost anybody. I think it can be a test of a sense of humour. If no one laughs at that, humour is undetectable. So I would say fish slapping dance, yeah.
Michael Palin, thank you.
Thank you.
And next on BBC4, a classic episode from a classic series. Michael Palin sets off in search of some unforgettable travel companions in Around the World in 80 Days, 20 years on.